So, what is a counterplan? Somebody throw out a definition. What's a counterplan?
It's the neg's alt to the gov's plan.
Okay, so if the neg, just to be clear, if the neg doesn't read a counterplan, what happens? What is the neg defending?
Status quo.
Right. So typically, the debate is between the plan and the status quo, but a lot of the times, the status quo will not be very good, which is why we have the topic in the first place and why the neg reads, or why the AF reads a plan. And so sometimes the neg is going to want to read a counterplan that is better than both the plan and the status quo. And so basically, a counterplan is an opportunity cost to doing the 1AC. It's a plan that you couldn't do if you did the 1AC. Some people have described the counterplan as being an opportunity cost disadd to the plan. And I think that this is correct, but it's a little bit misleading because the counterplan, at least on sort of most theoretical accounts, isn't really a disadd, right? It's a separate advocacy. It's much like a plan, and it's not like the negative can just, read it in the same way they could a disadd. Although there's a recent trend toward people reading conditional counterplans, reading multiple counterplans, and sort of treating the counterplan as sort of just like one piece of a strategy rather as sort of the central advocacy that they're going for in the debate. And certainly whether you believe that the counterplan is the functional equivalent of a disadd, or whether you believe the counterplan is more like an affirmative plan, that'll probably inform how you view a lot of theory issues about the counterplan. But basically, a counterplan is just an opportunity cost, right? And so it has to be something that you couldn't do or you shouldn't do with the plan, right? And that will bear upon questions about competition, and will bear upon sort of whether the counterplan is better not only than the plan, but also better than a permutation. So, what goes into a counterplan? Let's just get this on the board. So what's the first part of a counterplan?
Text.
Text. The basic rule for a counterplan text is that the counterplan text should be written like a plain text. And this sounds really obvious, but you see a lot of debates where people will read counterplans like, do the plan except for. What's the problem with a counterplan that starts with do the plan except? Right, it doesn't have an actor. It doesn't really tell you what the counterplan is doing. And it's ultimately a lot less clear than a counterplan that actually looks like a plan, sounds like a plan, and is organized like a plan. You tell them. And so, yeah, so you want your counterplan to sort of, to look like a plan. And certainly, if you're writing, for instance, a plan-inclusive counterplan or a PIC, then you're going to want to explain at some point in the round, either in the LOC or in the MO, that your counterplan functionally does the AF except for. But that shouldn't be your text. That should be a solvency argument that you make, or a competition argument that you make. And your counterplan text should look like a plan, sound like a plan, be like a plan. So, counterplan competition, I think this is sort of where the real meat of most counterplan debates happens. So, remember that because a counterplan is sort of an opportunity cost to the plan, then the counterplan needs to be sort of better than the plan or the permutation. So, just so we're clear, what is a permutation?
It's a test of competition.
All right, it is a test of competition. That's a great point for two reasons. What does it mean to be a test of competition, first of all?
To see doing both, how many downfalls?
Yeah, to see if basically if there's a problem with doing both the plan and the counterplan. Not merely that it wouldn't be possible to do both, but maybe that it would not be advantageous to do both. Keep in mind too that if a counterplan is a test of or if a permutation is a test of competition, what is it not?
An advocacy.
An advocacy, right? And this is a issue that trips up a lot of people. That basically they say, well, if the plan is an advocacy and the counterplan is an advocacy, then the permutation, logically should be treated like an advocacy, and I should be able to sort of, treat it like an advocacy, read advantage of the permutation, and basically, go for the permutation as an advocacy in the PMR much in the same way that, you would go for the plan. And certainly, like, a lot of judges, they'll say the permutation is a test of competition, but then they'll basically be like, oh yeah, well I vote on the perm, because I think that the permutation solves, the permutation solves all the disad, and solves all the case. And it seems like when judges do that, they sort of, subliminally reinforce that the counterplan is supposed to be, or that the permutation is supposed to be treated like an advocacy, even though, everybody realizes that it's a test of competition. The only thing the permutation is there to do is to sort of resolve the question of whether the counterplan is a meaningful opportunity cost to the plan. So there are a variety of different ways that counterplans can be competitive with a plan. The most obvious way is mutual exclusivity, which basically means that you just can't do the plan and the counterplan at the same time. It is logically impossible. Mutual exclusivity, it's the easiest way to establish competition because it makes it literally logically impossible to do both the plan and the counterplan. But it's not necessary to be mutually exclusive, and certainly in most counterplan debates it would be possible to do both the plan and the counterplan. It just would not be advantageous to do so for reasons usually relating to the disad. You can also have, there's sort of a split in counterplan theory about how to think about competition. There are two basic ideas here, which are textual and functional competition. So we'll start with functional because that's the one that everybody seems to get. So what is functional competition? Nick,
Yeah,
what's functional competition?
basically, like, the counterplan is either, like I said, it's mutually exclusive, it'll have some sort of disad to it that will make it functionally competitive, i.e. there will be the net benefit, or an opportunity cost, or the disad will be the opportunity cost, which is the functional competition. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, yeah, that functional competition basically means that there's some functional opportunity cost to doing the plan at the expense of the counterplan, and is therefore net beneficial to do the counterplan in lieu of doing the plan. There's another school of thought, which is that the counterplan it has to be not only functionally competitive, but also has to be textually competitive. And a lot of people seem to like the idea of textual competition, even though nobody can seem to agree on what textual competition means. So there are a bunch of different definitions that people throw out for textual competition. One of them is that the counterplan can't include any of the operative words in the plan. There's some that say that the counterplan, if you wrote a sentence containing the plan and the counterplan, it would be like logically incoherent, and that makes a counterplan textually competitive. There's some people who merely say that textual competition means that the counterplan has to compete on some word that's in the text of the plan. And this actually is important because a lot of the times when people read a plan, they won't specify everything in the plan. And think about why this is, right? Like if you have the USFG pass a law, like a big bill that has like 1,000 pages in it, and you don't have the plan, you specify every subcommittee that it goes through and every person who signs it, and every agency that's responsible for implementing the plan and its mandates, and all the appropriations. You wouldn't do that because you would not only have a 7-minute plan text, you would have like a 700,000 minute plan text. And so generally, we take all the the boring details and we smush them into this term normal means. And so a lot of the time, people will read counterplans that sort of compete on normal means. And this is okay, as normal means is sort of good as a shorthand for all the sort of mushy stuff that goes on behind the scenes. But the problem is that when you start having counterplans that compete on normal means, then you get a lot of really interesting counterplans that we sort of intuitively think are not theoretically legitimate. To take one obvious example, normally when when the U.S. makes a law, as we all learned in Schoolhouse Rock, that Congress that both houses of Congress will pass the bill, more than 50% of the House and Senate, and then the president will sign it. That's the normal means. So some teams have decided that they are going to advocate having the both houses pass the bill, the president veto the bill, and then having the House and the Senate override the veto, and that they'll pass the bill that way. This counterplan is colloquially known as veto Cheeto, because people seem to think that this counterplan is cheating, even though if you believe that counterplans are allowed to compete on normal means, that this would seem to be legitimate and certainly is functionally competitive. And so in order to limit out counterplans like veto Cheeto or the 9-0 Supreme Court counterplan or other sorts of tricks like that, some people have advocated that counterplans have to be both textually and functionally competitive because adding in textual competition is sort of an additional limit on counterplans that prevents a lot of these. And a lot of people make the argument that this is a good principle in any form of debate, but especially in parliamentary debate where you don't have back files, you don't have you only have 20 minutes of research before the round, you don't always know the topic before the round, and so certainly the need to sort of limit down the acceptable range of negative strategies might be more important in parliamentary debate in a way that it's not important or as important in policy debate. And that's a reason why even if we believe that functional competition was a good principle for policy, that maybe that we should have require both textual and functional competition for parley, especially because it's so easy to come up with various sorts of process counterplans that might not be textual competitive. So that's sort of the gist of the textual versus functional competition debate. But the important thing to know is just that there are a lot of people out there who sort of believe that textual competition is important because it serves as sort of an important limit on what counterplans can be out there and sort of what the range of acceptable counterplans is. And people who sort of believe, and this sort of, gets into a debate that people have a lot of times about counterplans. Like, there was a big, if any of you guys read Net Benefits, for instance, there was a long thread about, whether conditional counterplans were acceptable or not. And one argument that a couple people on that thread made that I find really compelling is that, maybe the problem isn't with conditional counterplans and the fact that you can kick counterplans. Maybe the problem is with the substance of the counterplans that we think are acceptable in parliamentary debate. And not that, people are kicking counterplans, but the people who are running counterplans like veto Cheeto, 9-0, consult, delay, all sorts of counterplans that compete on normal means. And that are not theoretically legitimate. The way that we should address these counterplan questions is not, at the level of conditional counterplans versus not, but rather that we should use textual competition as a way of limiting out the substance of counterplans that we think are uniquely abusive in parliamentary debate. So, those are the basic sort of schools of thought about competition. There's also an argument that gets made a lot called philosophical competition, which is basically that the idea of the counterplan is inconsistent with the idea of the plan. For instance, if the plan, sometimes people will make the argument that if the AF is a tax and the counterplan is a subsidy, that somehow that these things are sort of philosophically competitive with one another because they're different ideas about how to engage in regulation. And so, they're inconsistent in that way, even though they're clearly, you could have both a tax and a subsidy at the same time. And so, philosophical competition is usually not a good way of thinking about competition. The one possible exception is that there are certain times when you'll read like either a counterplan with a critical net benefit or a critique with kind of like a policy alternative. And in those situations, philosophical competition may be a little bit more viable simply because of the nature of the advantage of the counterplan or the disad of the plan that you're claiming. Right, because if you're essentially claiming that their AF is bad because they use bad reps, bad methodology, etc., then having a counterplan that doesn't engage in that might be, good and that might be sort of a form of philosophical competition. But in sort of straightforward policy debates, philosophical competition probably is not going to get you all that far. So what's after text and competition in a counterplan? What's the next thing you got to set up? Solvency. Very, very important. The number one reason that people lose in counterplan debates when they're negged. The number one reason that AFs win counterplan debates is this sentence: the counterplan doesn't solve the AF. And so you really need to make sure in counterplan debates that you do solve all or most of the 1AC. And if you don't solve the case, you are probably going to lose the debate. You know, maybe if you have a disad that is really big or really fast, that you might be able to win the debate even without the counterplan. But usually, at least if you're debating a competent team, their AF is going to claim some really big impacts, right? They're probably going to claim some giant extinction level impact, and you know, usually even some propensity of winning that argument is going to outweigh whatever dissad you have. And usually the AF is probably going to be a little bit sort of better reasoned, better structured, better thought out than your dissad will be, and they'll probably have a more plausible story for how they get to their impact as opposed to you, all things being equal. That's not always true, but usually, at least against good teams, and at least at tournaments with topic areas especially, the AF is usually going to be pretty well developed. And so what you need to do is to have really good arguments about why the counterplan will solve all or almost all. I mean, you want to probably claim that the counterplan solves all the case, because most times the judges will either find that the counterplan solves all the case, or they'll find that the counterplan solves most of the case, and that the sort of the residual link to the dissad outweighs whatever marginal solvency benefit that the AF gets vis-a-vis the counterplan. And certainly, I mean, you want to sort of tease that out for judges when you're debating too, right? Like, you need to say, look, we think we solve all of the AF, but even if we didn't solve all of the AF, you know, the portion of the AF that we do solve is still enough to for the dissad to outweigh the marginal risk of the affirmative, right? That's the argument that you want to make to judges, because I think that allows judges to say, yeah, you know, I don't have to, you know, believe that you solve all of the AF, because I can find that you solve some of the AF and you still win the debate. One thing to watch out for is you have to make sure that your counterplan is structurally capable of solving. So here is an example. Suppose that the topic is the United States federal government should you know, significantly increase individuals' ability to discharge educational debt in bankruptcy. And this is, I guess, a substantive law question too, in addition to a counterplan question. But what is a counterplan that could not solve this AF? Who could not do the counterplan?
States.
The states. States cannot do the counterplan. States cannot regulate bankruptcy. They can't regulate patents. They can't regulate foreign policy. That's a more obvious example. And so having a state's counterplan in a foreign policy debate or in, you know, a patent regulation debate is a bad idea, because your counterplan just cannot solve. And similarly, you need to make sure that the AF doesn't have any sort of hidden tricks to get around the counterplan. One really obvious example of this is that in foreign policy debates, typically the way they happen is that the AF will say that the USFG should, you know, for instance, suppose that the topic is like USFG should significantly increase, you know, peacekeeping assistance to the Congo or something. And the AF is probably going to read, they might read like, you know, Africa relations, hedge, US leadership type advantages. And a lot of the time the neg will say France should do the counterplan, or the AU should do the counterplan, or the UN should do the counterplan. And there you have a really obvious problem if you're the neg, because if the AF is claiming advantages like US leadership or hedge, then you're going to have some serious issues when they say that the counterplan doesn't use the US and so it can't solve for US hedge, and that the plan is the key opportunity to, you know, push back against China or whatever. Right, and that's a typical way that the AF will build in tricks into the 1AC to indicate that the counterplan can't solve, right? And especially when you have alternate agent counterplans, you always want arguments when you're affirmative about why the agent that you've picked or the agent in the resolution is absolutely key to do the plan. And when the resolution specifies an agent, you should probably spend at least 5-10 seconds of prep thinking of a couple of arguments about why that particular agent is key, why it might be the only agent that can regulate in this area, or, you know, in a foreign policy topic, why it might be the best country to do this, etc. You look confused.
I'm not, I just, yeah.
Okay. Let me take a break now. Questions. We should take and try to break this down a little bit. Okay.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
You gave an example of the Congo and then having like the United Nations do the plan. Even though that doesn't solve for the advantages that the app isolates, could you read solvency for UN hedge being better than American hedge?
Yes, and you should do that.
Okay.
Right, because you should see this coming if you're the neg,
Sure.
and you should make a couple. There are a couple different ways you could do this. You could say UN hedge key, UN credibility key, and that's more important than US hedge. Hedge bad is a good way to do this. If you think that they're going to claim advantages from US leadership, US hedge, those are arguments that you should have impact turns to. And so you can sort of get around this issue in a variety of different ways. But yeah, I think that's what you have to do is that certainly there's times when you aren't going to be able to solve the entire 1AC. And those situations, you either need to impact turn those portions of the 1AC or find some other way of getting around them. Because you don't want them to be able to leverage, because there will be times you just can't solve everything. And you don't want the AF to be able to leverage those arguments. Ideally, the way that you get around that is if the counterplan solves, but if the counterplan can't solve, then you have to do something else. Another good example of this is that occasionally, if you get one of these resolutions, it's like, you know, the United States federal government should pass the, you know, the malarkey mumbo jumbo bill, or whatever. The neg is oftentimes going to read a pick where they will pass, you know, all of it but one section that they think is really bad. Oftentimes the AF will have some sort of like politics arguments or econ arguments about why passing the entire bill is key. You know, for instance, like maybe that there was a really fragile political coalition that was necessary to get this bill passed in the first place, and that if it's passed with an amendment, that this is going to piss off whatever person was responsible for expending their political capital to sort of forge this coalition. And I'm not saying that that specific argument is always best, but that's sort of the genre of argument that you want to be thinking about in these sort of counterpoint debates. The last thing, and it's not really part of the counterplan per se, is that you want a disad or an external net benefit to go along with the counterplan, right? Because if you just say that your counterplan, you know, we have this counterplan and it solves the case, well, that's great, but then, you know, if the counterplan solves the AF and the plan solves the AF, then, you know, why vote neg, right? And usually the answer to that is that you have a disad that the AF links to, either the plan links to or the permutation links to, but the counterplan doesn't link to. And so you want a disad, like any disad, it should turn the case and or outweigh the case. Generally, you don't really want small disads, although, you know, I mean, obviously this is a big sort of trenchant debate about whether you want sort of like small plausible disads versus, you know, big stick kind of, you know, high impact, low risk disads. And that's a debate that goes back and forth, but fundamentally, you know, especially in this day and age, it's getting more difficult to win on the small plausible disad. And so, yeah.
Wouldn't with a pick, you'd want a small disad because you solve 99% of the AF, and there's just kind of this small thing you have to be
Well, I mean, just because you solve 99% of the AF, I mean, that makes it more okay to have a small disad.
Right.
But similarly, if you can have a small pick and a big disad, that's even better.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, certainly, and again, like, sometimes you're, and I think you should also distinguish between sort of like, sometimes you'll have a disad where you have a really specific uniqueness and link story, and it's sort of small in that way that your story is really sort of narrow and nuanced, but then your impact argument still can be pretty big. And so that's just sort of a question of how you structure a disad in general. It doesn't really have a lot to do with counterplans, but it's important that you make sure that, one, that the counterplan doesn't trigger the disad, and two, that the permutation doesn't solve the link to the disad. Yeah?
If you're in a debate and you're getting thumped on the disad,
Mm-hmm.
in a world where, I mean, this is a bad strategy to do the system, but how do you thresh out that solvency is a reason to vote for the counterplan if you have better solvency than the AF?
I mean, I think you just say that. You just say, look, if we win, that the counterplan, solves whatever advantages the AF isolates better than the plan does, then that's a reason to vote for us. The problem in practice in most debates is that it can be very difficult to beat the permutation if you're just going for counterplan just solves better. Because usually whatever reasons you identify for why the counterplan solves better, just in a vacuum without a link to a disad, a lot of the times you're going to run into trouble against the permutation. So you probably want some, I think you can still say, look, even if there's only a small risk of the disad, or even if we're not going to win this impact module in the disad, we'll still win the smaller impact module. And if we also win that the counterplan, solves the case better, then that's a reason to vote for us. Right? And certainly I think you can say, look, the disad debate is up in the air, but fundamentally counterplan solves the case better, use that as a tiebreaker.
So on the flip side of that, if you're the AF, how do you phrase that presumption flows out? Because essentially the negative is doing the plan, so what if they solve better?
Yeah,
most of the time they're not going to solve that much better.
Right. I think that's a really useful point, is that, because presumption does flip to the AF when the neg reads a counterplan, at least under sort of most accounts, then, just because, and it's just saying we solve better, it depends on whether the specific arguments that the AF is claiming, because sometimes, solvency will sort of be a binary issue. Either you do solve the link or you don't. Other times it will be more like how many lives do you save, how many dollars do you save. And in situations where it's more of a gradient, then saying we solve better may be a compelling argument in situations where it's either like you trigger the link or you don't. But those are all just sort of things to think about. So those are sort of some big picture ideas about counterplans, and now let's sort of get into the weeds and talk about different types of counterplans. The first is the alternate agent counterplan. So what's an alternate agent counterplan?
You use a different agent, like you use the DEA, you use Congress, use the states.
Yeah. So states, let's see, branch, a different country or regional actor. So there are a couple of different sort of issues that you want to be aware of in alternate agent counterplans debates. One is obviously you need a reason that the alternate agent should do the plan on its own rather than in combination with whatever agent the AF uses, right? You need an argument why the states alone is better than the federal government plus the states, right? This is why everybody in the states debates reads a federalism disad, because the permutation of federal government plus the states obviously doesn't solve the federalism disad. If you say that states are overregulated right now, states need more independence, saying, well, we should have the federal government work in coordination with the states, doesn't really solve the link to your federalism disad. So again, you need to sort of be thinking about what the permutation is going to look like and why you get around the permutation. In terms of different agency, like the DEA counterplan, you want to be careful about what agent the AF has actually specified. For instance, a lot of the times, the AF will just say USFG should do the plan, and then if you say DEA should do the plan, then you have a problem because the DEA is part of the United States federal government, and it seems like permutation to the counterplan is a pretty compelling argument in that situation. And so one way you can obviously protect yourself against this is by reading a vagueness or specification argument along with your counterplan, just to protect your counterplan links. And that sort of works really well for you, because if they try to if they say permutation to the counterplan, or try to say that the DEA counterplan is the same thing as the plan, then it seems like you have a pretty good abuse story on vagueness or on your spec argument. And so those are just sort of some things to keep in mind. You also, I think those are the two biggest issues with alternate agent counterplans. There aren't really theoretical issues with them. With some exceptions. I mean, there are arguments that, for instance, using the states is bad because the states involves multi-actor fiat, which is bad because it sort of fiats that 50 different states are going to collectively do something, and that's bad. Sometimes there are issues with alternate agent counterplans when you use a private actor as your alternate agent. For instance, on the data regulation topic, or data privacy topic at the NPTE this year, we had a counterplan to have Google do the plan, and nobody made this argument, but it seems like you can make some pretty plausible arguments that allowing non-governmental actors to do the plan is problematic because there's just like an infinite range of them, and if you could just pick any NGO or any company to do the plan, then you're going to have some problems. It's going to make it very difficult to come up with predictable affirmative strategies if you could just like have Google do the plan. You can obviously sort of just change the counterplan mandate. This is sort of the bread and butter counterplan, where you just do something different. I'm not going to say too much more about this. There's the PIC. What does PIC stand for? Anybody?
Inclusive
counterplay.
Right, it's a plan inclusive counterplan. It is a counterplan that includes, most of the 1AC, and that just usually excludes one item. The most obvious example here is that when you have, where the Congress should pass some bill, and then you find some random provision in the bill that, is basically either just some like Christmas tree provision that, gives $100 million to some, terrible project, or, that they put like, basically the thing is that when Congress passes legislation, they oftentimes just have completely unrelated items in the legislation because, it's just a big Christmas tree appropriations bill, and so they'll put funding for something terrible in there, or they'll cut funding for something good, and then you can just pick out of that part. That's the most obvious example, and it seems like even though the legitimacy of PICs has been pretty well established in Parley for a while, it seems like people are much more willing to vote on the argument now that that even if plan inclusive counterplans are normally legitimate, for the obvious reasons that they test the affirmative plan, that the affirmative should have to defend the entire plan, it's good for policy making, that the AF gets to pick their plan, so they should have to defend the entire plan. It seems now that on topics that force the affirmative to pass an entire bill, it seems like people are much more willing to vote on the argument that plan inclusive counterplans are illegitimate on those resolutions because there's only one AF that the affirmative can read, right? The only thing they can do is to pass the entirety of this bill, which likely has hundreds or thousands of different moving parts, and that allowing the negative to just sort of like go on Wikipedia, figure out the one thing about the bill that is not good, and then to pick out of that makes the debate exceedingly difficult for the affirmative. And so in those situations, a lot of judges are very receptive to the argument that plan inclusive counterplans are bad. Actually, it might be worth it just briefly to sort of sketch out this debate a little bit. So let's start with PICs good. Why might PICs be good? We can just come up with a bunch of reasons.
Best policy.
Okay. BPO, policy option.
Which most real world.
Plan. Most real world. These are sort of the basic ones. Encourages better plan writing. So these are the basic sort of like 4 or 5 arguments that everybody makes about why PICs are good. Why might PICs be bad? Not predictable. Yeah.
It's the entirety of the app often.
Yeah. PMC. And obviously you want to contextualize these to the resolution. Certainly, you know, if we were to come up with a sliding scale of resolutions where picks were good as opposed to where picks were bad, it seems like, you know, for instance, if you go to, pick one obvious example, well, NPDA is actually a lot better about this now, but if you go to like your local community college tournament, and sometimes you'll get some, you know, some metaphor resolutions or something, and you'll read a policy F, and on those situations where, you know, the topic is oust the elephant or something stupid, and, you know, the AF basically gets to read whatever they want to, then in those situations, it seems like picks are obviously much more viable and are much more legitimate than they would be if the topic is, you know, the USFG should pass, you know, the Feinstein-Markey Act, where there's only one possible affirmative that they can read. So that's picks in a nutshell. Another type of counterplan is the consult counterplan, in which the counterplan is to engage in binding consultation over the mandate of the plan with some foreign entity. And typically the argument is that the consult counterplan is competitive because normal means would entail passing the plan unilaterally, and that the counterplan is therefore functionally competitive because it does not pass the plan unilaterally. It only passes the plan sort of if upon binding consultation with some other entity. So why might consult? Well, let's do the same thing. Why might consult counterplans be good? Let's start with that argument.
Inclusivity,
What do you mean?
like, it gives a voice to some group that wasn't gonna be recognized in action before.
Well, that seems more like an argument about why the counterplan is substantively good, not why they're theoretically
Oh, okay.
legitimate.
That makes sense.
I mean, there are a few, right? Like, again, best policy option, especially in foreign policy topics. You know, one of the big debates that people have in foreign policy is about whether the United States should act more multilaterally or more unilaterally. And certainly having a debate about whether we should pass a particular plan in a sorry, the bug. Conditionally as opposed, or in consultation with some other country as opposed to unilaterally seems to be an important issue that a lot of foreign policy thinkers talk about. It does test whether the plan is the best policy option, and certainly that the AF could get around this issue by just not saying normal means, and the AF doesn't have to say normal means. The AF could do the plan in a variety of different ways that would make consult competitive, and the fact that they decided to be lazy and say normal means, that's their fault, and that gives you ground to be able to read consult. What might be some arguments for why consultation is not legitimate?
Infinite number of actors.
Okay. Yeah, so there's literally 190 countries that you could consult. If you start adding in NGOs and private actors, it gets to be infinite number of people. So other one of the big things that happens in consults debates, and this is both a theory issue and sort of a substantive issue, is the yes-no debate, where basically having a counterplan where it's not clear whether the counterplan actually happens because it's not established whether the counterplan says, whether the country that you're consulting says yes or no to the counterplan is problematic, because it ultimately means that you get stable disad links if you can't establish whether the counterplan says yes or no, or whether the other country says yes or no. And there too, it seems like the way you would get around that is that it's like, well, you know, we could just, you know, stipulate or fiat that, you know, China says yes. But that brings up a different problem, which is that a lot of consult counterplans are functionally object fiat, right? Like, they say, oh, we'll engage in binding consultation. But what says that, you know, China or any other country that we engage in consultation with is going to come to the table at all, right? Why is that okay for the negative fiat? I mean, that's a viable argument that that consult counterplans sort of require object fiat, and that object fiat is fundamentally bad because it basically allows you to fiat weight your impacts. There's also condition counterplans, which have a lot of the same problems, where you you say, oh, we'll do the plan conditional on X. That's a problem because you don't know if X is going to happen, and it screws with your uniqueness, it screws with the stability for disadd links. And those are all reasons why condition counterplans might not be theoretically legitimate. Same thing with delay counterplans, where you do the counterplan at some point in the future. The problem is that it's very difficult to develop uniqueness arguments based on the future because you can only speculate about what's going to happen. And so if you can't get, disadd links that are predicated on what will happen in 6 months or a year or whenever the counterplan is delaying till, then that's going to be quite difficult for, that's pretty bad for the AF's ground. Yeah.
It's also, I feel like it's also susceptible to time frame arguments. If you delay it, the AF solves something, it solves with it.
Yes.
It is.
Yeah, obviously if the AF happens faster, then you have some solvency problems with delay. And these arguments also apply to the study counterplan, which I haven't seen for a while, but there are occasionally times when the neg will just be like, oh, well, we should commission this panel to study this issue. And it's not clear what that would solve, but it also has some you don't know what the results of the study are going to be, you don't know what their conclusions will be, and so it makes it very difficult to generate uniqueness or links for dissadds. There are a bunch of other process counterplans, things like Veto Cheeto, 9.0. Back when, before Obamacare passed, our go-to counterplan was to pass Obamacare through reconciliation, which is a means by which the Senate is allowed to pass budget amendments without a filibuster, and we would just pass it through reconciliation and then read politics. Those sorts of things, those obviously implicate a lot of the same issues that we talked about with textual v. functional competition, and about whether it is acceptable for counterplans to compete on normal means. The last kind of counterplan I want to talk about is the advantage counterplan, which is I think a very savvy trick. What is an advantage counterplan? Somebody? Yeah.
It's a counterplan, obviously, with some sort of extra thing that they solve for, right? Like, you would read, your counterplan would have some, maybe it was an econ counterplan,
Right.
and you had an econ advantage to it that the app couldn't capture, and so you solve that.
Right. So that's one way of doing the advantage counterplan. The other way too is that, for instance, if the app reads a plan that claims to solve for poverty in the U.S. and it's some complicated long link story about how the app is able to, for instance, suppose that the resolution's a farm subsidies topic, and the AF, expands some big farm subsidy and claims this will drive down food prices, and will ultimately, be better for people because people can afford to eat, and that's good because starving is, dehumanizing and bad. And the neg might say, counterplan, the U.S. FG should do a new round of economic stimulus. Ultimately, will solve root cause of poverty. Will solve poverty. Basically give people a giant check that can go used to buy food, solve their poverty impacts, and then read, WTO disadd, against U.S. trade, against U.S. agricultural subsidies, right? That's a very typical advantage counterplan strategy, where you just have some, completely independent means of solving one of the impact arguments in the AF, and then you read a disadd. And that can be really savvy because a lot of the time people just not really expect what your advantage counterplan is going to be, and you can just do all sorts of stuff. And you can also claim a lot of external net benefits, right? If you read a stimulus counterplan as an advantage counterplan, there's all sorts of external economic impacts that you could read about why stimulus came now. You're obviously, you run into problems with the permutation, and the permutation will often solve some of your external net benefits like that. But usually the permutation still won't resolve the link to the disadd, and so the advantage counterplan can be a good trick for that issue. The last thing I want to talk about for about 10 minutes and then field some questions are just some theoretical issues that come up in counterplan debates. The first is the status of counterplan. So the three types of statuses for counterplans are conditional, unconditional, and then dispositional. I'll go sort of in that order. conditional counterplans are counterplans that you are allowed to kick at any time, right? They basically are disads that you can, that you can kick. And this sort of goes back to what we were talking about at the start of the lecture about whether counterplans should be conceived of as opportunity cost disads as opposed to advocacies. And if you believe that they're opportunity cost disads, then you might believe that conditionality is correct because fundamentally that the counterplan is just a test of whether the app is a good idea or not. And just like a disad, if you are losing arguments as to why the counterplan is a good or bad idea, then you should just be able to kick the counterplan and go for some other arguments because fundamentally all the negative has to do is sort of disprove that the affirmative is a good idea. Of course, there are a lot of arguments against conditional counterplans that they screwed with the stability of your disad links because you can't get stable offense on a counterplan if they can just kick the counterplan, and that really screws with your MG time allocation and strategy. There are also arguments that what are other arguments about why conditionality is bad? We'll just open the floor.
Incentivize bad counterplan writing.
Yeah, it incentivizes bad counterplan writing because if people have to stick with the counterplan, then they'll be more likely to put more thought into what the counterplan says. People might say that conditionality is bad because it would justify multiple counterplans, which would make it extremely difficult to generate stable disad links because you don't know which counterplan they're going to go for. It also means that it forces you to sort of make inconsistent arguments because you would have to argue against not only the counterplan but also against the status quo, and that you wouldn't know which of those arguments you would get to keep until the MO kicked the counterplan or went for the counterplan, which would make it very difficult to give the MG bifurcates your time. It would be really unfair, and you would couple that with arguments about why the MG is a uniquely important speech or why the MG is a uniquely hard speech. And so those are sort of the basic arguments against conditionality. If you're really interested in this question, there was like a 200 post net benefits thread in which basically every possible argument against conditionality, good or bad, was made. And so you can come through that to find some stuff. And then there's unconditionality, which is the complete opposite, where once you read the counterplan, that you have to advocate the counterplan for the entirety of the debate. Keep in mind that even in a world of unconditionality, you may not have to actually, go for the counterplan, that you could still shadow cover the counterplan and go for other arguments, but you would still need to sort of keep the counterplan in the debate and give the AF access to the permutation or give the AF access to sort of offensive arguments against the counterplan. But you wouldn't necessarily have to be like, well, you're going for the counterplan. You just need to say, look, the counterplan's in the round, shadow cover it and then do other stuff and go for other arguments. Keep in mind too that even if you have an unconditional counterplan, there's one situation where you're allowed to kick the counterplan, and that's if you go all in for T or a theory argument. Because in those situations, nobody is ever going to vote against you because you didn't go for an unconditional counterplan, because you decided to go all in for the argument. They're not topical, and therefore you should win. And then there is dispositionality, which is sort of an interesting hybrid of the two, which basically says that that you can kick the counterplan if they go for a permutation because the permutation would prove that the counterplan is not competitive and therefore not an opportunity cost. But if they straight turn the counterplan, then you're stuck with it. And that seems to be an interesting hybrid, although it still does raise some of the same issues of conditionality because you don't sort of know, when you read the. There are arguments against conditionality that you could also make against dispositionality to the extent that, you still don't know if the counterplan is going to be in the round, and so you still, there still would be the opportunity to revert to the status quo if you read a permutation. And dispositionality might also be bad because functionally, if you're affirmative, you're debating counterplan, you have to read a permutation. It's not really an option to not read a permutation against a counterplan. And so just because dispositionality theoretically would let you keep the counterplan in the round by not reading a permutation, that might not be a realistic strategic choice to expect of an affirmative, and that might be a reason why dispositionality is still bad and is still inferior to unconditionality. Multiple counterplans are kind of like conditionality on steroids. That basically they are not only conditional by nature because you couldn't have multiple unconditional counterplans, but they, fundamentally, that leaves the affirmative, or the negative, the opportunity to go not only for each of the counterplans or several of the counterplans, but also to go for the status quo. And then, if bifurcating your time in the MG is bad, then certainly splitting your MG into thirds or quarters is even worse. But then again, as some people may make, the same arguments that multiple counterplans are good because they test the best policy option, that they encourage better plan writing, that if each individual counterplan is a reason to reject the affirmative, there's no reason that multiple counterplans are not also a reason to reject the affirmative, etc. Counterplans like consult, delay, condition, they raise this issue basically about future uniqueness, which is again this argument that when you do the counterplan and it's not clear if the counterplan is going to happen or the counterplan might be implemented at some point in the future, then that might be bad because it might mean that you don't get stable disad links, or you can't make sort of predictive claims about what's going to happen in the future, that you can't read a politics disad that's predicated on what's going to happen a year from now because nobody knows what the political scene is going to look like. And those are all reasons why those sort of counterplans might be theoretically objectionable. And that's sort of like, I think, the first argument you should make if somebody reads consult, delay, condition, that type of counterplan. Again, just like plans, vagueness and spec arguments apply in much the same way. And you should, if the counterplan is vague, you should call them out on that, especially because with a counterplan, if they're allowed to re-clarify what the counterplan means in the MO or in the block, then the only time that you ever get to respond to that is the PMR. And that's bad because, it's hard to make new arguments in the PMR, and it's also puts you in a position where, you have to where you basically can't use the MG and that your MG time gets robbed from you because the counterplan becomes something fundamentally different during the block. And those are all reasons that can sort of be useful when you make vagueness or spec arguments. And they're the exact same arguments you would make against a plan. You just make them against a counterplan. You want to be a little bit careful about counterplans that involve object fiat. What is object fiat? Somebody?
Like basically fiating something that probably fiating that China would say yes to something, even though you can't guarantee that they would say yes.
Right. So fiating, especially when you fiat away, the object of the resolution or the harms of the resolution. Like if you make if you read, for instance, a big sort of trade aff that involves a China war scenario, reading a counterplan to have China change its trade policy, is really problematic because, fundamentally it just lets you fiat away the impact arguments that the affirmative is isolated. And so, usually if you have a counterplan that fiats the sort of the object of the resolution, right? Like if the topic is the USFG should change its foreign policy, toward China. If China is the actor in your counterplan, you probably are going to lose a theory debate. That's a good rule of thumb. The last thing to talk about, and again this gets back to the issue of textual v. functional competition, are counterplans that are sort of artificially competitive. So to give you an example, right, suppose that you have an aff, any aff, whatever the plan is, and the neg wants to say that the counterplan is world peace. What's the problem with a counterplan of let's have world peace, among other things?
One is a theoretical impact, it's never happened.
Okay, but what would the aff say? What's a really easy argument if they say do the aff and the neg says world peace? It starts with a P. The permutation. So one way that an enterprising negative might try to get around this problem is by saying counterplan, world peace, and don't do the plan. And that seems to be a problem because that the counterplan is artificially competitive, that the only reason that it is competitive or is exclusive with the affirmative is because it bans the affirmative. And sort of this is a problem that you see with sort of ban the plan counterplans, that they functionally exist only to only basically to artificially generate uniqueness for whatever disad that they want to go for, especially if it's true that the counterplan would also link to the disad, that sometimes they will just try to generate uniqueness just by banning the plan, to sort of supercharge whatever uniqueness or link arguments that they would get on the disad debate. And there, that might be problematic to the extent that it basically lets you read counterplans that are not a meaningful test of the desirability of the plan. And there are a bunch of arguments that you can make about why artificial competition is bad. And that is basically it for Counterplans 101. I think that there's a lot of issues that don't get covered in this lecture, and those get sort of broached in the other two Counterplan lectures we have. But while we're still here, does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I saw this strategy and I still don't understand it, so I'm wanting some clarification.
Okay.
It was a Russia weapons debate, right?
Right.
Something like START or something, I don't remember, but the negative team reads consult Russia, and then goes for Russia says no as the way to create the uniqueness that they need, and then the counterplan no longer solves, but they agree with that, and then they go for the case turns and the disad. How does that work? The counterplan is also unconditional.
Well, basically they, it's a weird strategy, but fundamentally that all that the AF is saying is that, or what the neg is saying is just that, that the best way to get Russia to do this is to, consult them even if they'll say no, and then them saying no after being consulted is what triggers the links, not the plan.
Okay.
And it seems like, obviously, it's not clear sort of why a failed consultation would be more likely to piss Russia off than would, just doing the plan without consulting Russia.
Right.
And that's probably a very good argument for the affirmative to make.
Okay.
But, it makes logical sense. Sort of, it's not, incoherent. It's just probably not a very good argument. All right, well, it looks like Chris has some things to say about something else. And it's 2:30, so I'm gonna let you go. But thanks for listening, and if you have any questions about counterplans or anything, just come find me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Alex.